Thank you, Arctic Acoustic. I love the music. Hey, everybody. Thank you for coming back to Hanging with History. This is Season 1, That Miracle That Happened, That One Time. And this is Episode 22, The Reformation, Martin Luther. The alternative title would be Martin Luther, They Didn't Have a Prayer. And we'll be joined a little bit later by Joltin Joe, a man after his tempestuous baseball career and all those years he spent on the front pages of the tabloids, settled down to become one of the most noble men you could ever meet. We're glad to have him on the program. Last week, we introduced some historical analysis via Stirner and Burke that we're going to use on the English Reformation. And we introduced history's equivalent of P equals NP, the hard problem. I think we need to briefly introduce Kurt Gödel. He is, or rather was, an Austrian mathematician who proved that there are true statements that cannot be proven. Or at least that's the way I used to think about incompleteness theorems. A better way to express it can be found in Scott Aaronson's book, Quantum Computing Since Democrates. Aaronson's one of the world's experts in quantum computing at MIT, moved to UT Austin now. So why is he talking about that ancient Greek philosopher who introduced the idea of atoms almost 3,000 years ago? The real importance of that idea is that Democrates reasoned himself into the position that things that were truly continuous, just one thing, rather than made up of many things, were quite difficult to deal with logically. So he invented the idea of atoms almost 3,000 years ago because it was intellectually easier than a world without them. The power of pure thought. Interesting as that is, we're not here to discuss quantum computing. Aaronson's book has the best description I've ever seen of Gödel's theorems. It's quite accessible. I recommend them to you. I'm living proof you don't have to be a mathematical genius to understand it. What he does is lay out, 17 axioms that describe all of mathematics. And this is a lot more fun than it seems. Following this and getting how one leads to the other and how they interrelate, treat it as a game, and it's a really good time. A really good source of that galaxy brain feeling. Then he says one thing, something startling. These axioms that describe all mathematics cannot be proved, especially by reference to themselves. But, you splutter to yourself, he's just described the basic and obvious truth. And then it begins to dawn on you that the rigorous process of demonstrating mathematics has not proven the process, nor proven the existence of logic itself. David Hume had his version of this too, just not as rigorous as Aaronson. It was quite a moment of intellectual clarity, and though I'm probably going to misuse the idea, any method of historical analysis cannot validate itself either, so skepticism is warranted, as Stirner would no doubt have warned us about any cause with a capital C. The Reformation is a tricky subject, and we need to understand even more background first.
Feels like many episodes of background already.
This is a harder one, because it's going to involve something you already know about. Prayer. I think that what we understand about prayer today is an obstacle to understanding the 16th century.
What? People didn't pray the same?
I think they probably did, and more. A quiet prayer before you do something risky, in a moment of doubt, in grief. I think we're the same as 16th century people in these kind of hobbit ways. Even the more religiously valid prayers, like "Let your will be done," is basically a personal prayer for strength or acceptance. But what they had back then was also what amounted to a prayer industry.
A prayer industry? What would be the point of that?
No one called it a prayer industry at the time, but many, many thousands of people had it as their jobs to pray all day for the souls of other people. Hence my calling it a prayer industry. It's hard to imagine those could be quite as sincere or effective as the more personal ones we mentioned earlier.
It was their job to pray.
Yeah, and let's see if we can climb this wall that separates us from our fellows in the 16th century. Purgatory was the cause of the industry. Purgatory is the notion that some continued perfection of the soul, post-mortem, is necessary to come to God. You can well imagine that not everyone thought of it the same way. Many intellectuals in the church didn't think much of the idea of purgatory. Augustine had his justification by faith, which is justification by grace idea. The Bible doesn't mention purgatory, but it became a widely held idea believed in by most. It was an innovation in the 11th or 12th century where some people reasoned their way into its necessity. although the intellectual roots for it date from around Justinian's time. But it's a bit like what's before the Big Bang question that we mentioned in episode 20. It's got to do with the nature of God, and we have to make assumptions about that. Unprovable, no matter how vigorous our thinking after we have our axioms. People did this paid prayer thing all over, but predominantly in Northern Europe. It was bigger there. This idea was a bit like exercising a kind of control over death, influencing God directly. That might derive from the older pagan culture. At least some speculate that. Remember episode 4, the Lombards took advantage of Odin's promise in their founding myth? Applying some anthropological principles from history, when you do this kind of mass-scale praying to get people out of purgatory, it's as likely to produce a counter-reaction in later generations, just as any particular devotion will lead to that devotion becoming less effective. The purgatory industry was people you would pay to spend all day praying. And given the hard life that most people had, this might be seen as a pretty good gig, especially for a slacker. And given the poverty of the time, it was also a wealth sink. A bunch of people doing nothing economically productive. So combine this prayer industry, the notion of purgatory, suspicion that maybe we're not getting value for money with this idea of indulgences. Indulgences. Instead of paying monks to pay for your dear departed mother, you could give a traveling monk a penny for a week off purgatory. Great deal? Sometimes the next traveling monk selling indulgences would offer a sale. You could get a fortnight, 2 weeks off for a penny, 6 weeks off for 2 pennies. Is this starting to seem pretty silly to you?
The whole thing seems silly to me.
So we had a pope pretty desperate for money. Usually people say to build the new St. Peter's Basilica, which is truly impressive and must have been expensive. Go visit. But Pope Julius II was a warrior pope, trying to keep French and Spanish influence in Italy at bay. And that kind of thing is crazy expensive, and money is fungible. And he was willing to let people like the famous Tetzl go around selling indulgences, which was a get-out-of-purgatory deal. Although technically it could only be for sins where you'd already been forgiven. The sellers of indulgences got a cut, and they let all their Weasley marketing instincts run amok for a few years. Act now and you get 4 extra days out of purgatory. Today only, 50% off your time in purgatory. Act now, get your father and grandfather for the price of a grandmother out of purgatory. You even get a receipt for it. I'm not even exaggerating a little bit. You would have a hard time exaggerating how absolutely scummy and scammy it was. If you're like me, you get some sort of scam call every day. How do you feel about those scammers? Now direct those feelings to the universal church you depend upon for spiritual support. And Martin Luther, who'd breathed deep the heady Augustinian fumes of justification by grace, noticed what was going on, and he called one of the worst, scummiest indulgent sellers Tetzl, out by name for being a scummy, scammy, manipulator, hypocrite, criminal. These indulgences made up a good chunk of the famous 95 Theses he nailed to the door in Wittenberg. The church was very vulnerable to this criticism. Listen to this. The church was very vulnerable to this criticism that Tetzl was running a big con game. Because it was true, obviously. And everyone could see it. It was in your face, out in the open, conning pennies from simple people. The little boy was telling the town that the emperor had no clothes. Everyone could see it at once. The monks praying, or at least claiming they were praying, is kind of the same thing. It just feels a little more sincere, but it's still a con game. Northern Europe would get it, as they were more affected by it. They fell for the con. Southern Europe was more sophisticated, so the outrage was a smaller thing for them. We'll go back to Augustine and his ideas in a little bit, but personalities matter too in our great question of history. Tetzl demanded an apology from Luther, and I'm going to apologize to you listeners for seeming to simplify things down to a ridiculous level where 2 guys arguing were the lever that moved the world. Doesn't seem like it could be true.
That 2 guys made a difference sounds more likely to be true than the rest of this stuff.
Well, Tetzl complained to the bishop and demanded an apology. Luther refused. Oh, I should probably stop and mention that, Wittenberg was a university, a new university, and universities typically were not under the authority of a bishop. It was generally understood that people would be free to say things that outside the university might be considered a heresy. But inside, they could have quite a bit of free speech. Kind of weirdly the opposite of how it is now, where inside the university there might be less free speech than outside. That's funny, hadn't thought of that before. Anyway, Luther refused to apologize. The Pope wouldn't get involved at first. To Pope Leo X, it seemed like more squabbling between Dominicans and Augustinians. More of that endless intellectual blah, 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 just like today. He had Medici politics on his mind. The German Augustinians were meeting anyway, and they were supposed to settle things. And there Luther showed his rhetorical power. He treated indulgences as a minor matter and focused on God's suffering and his love for humanity. Instead of calling for resistance to papal authority, he called for a theology of the cross as opposed to a theology of glory. This is more subtle than I can express, but an extreme form of the devotion to love which is so subversive to the power structure of the time. He was so persuasive that even the Dominicans there began to believe in a theology for the weak and powerless without creating an attack on the existing church. These were all ideas in the air. Many others had them, but Luther's combination of intellect, powerfully speaking from the heart with evident sincerity, charisma, obvious devotion to love, and possibly timing, was unique. His audience, even his supposed enemies, went away convinced. How often does that happen? It didn't help him with Tetzl. Tetzl didn't want an argument. He didn't want thinking. He wanted a result, an apology. He wasn't there anyway. Tetzl posted a series of counter-arguments in favor of papal authority. The Pope said I could do it, so it's okay, even good and virtuous for me to scam those people, help them out of purgatory. Luther was all about grace. Authority and grace are skew lines. Nothing bridges these worldviews. Geometry is all. Throughout the next year, Luther's opponents called him to be obedient to Rome. And in the air, there was this dispute within the church about conciliarists that I mentioned last episode, who wanted to have a council to reform the church, and papal supremacists who did not. Conciliarists lost the argument, but Luther's position and his position against indulgences, which was a papal initiative to raise money, made it seem like he was taking sides in this other, bigger argument that everyone knew about and cared about. He wasn't, though. He was selling a theology of the weak and powerless based on love, but it smelled like this thing called conciliarism. That's what it was at first glance. This sort of thing happens a lot in history. Remember how Pelagius had to fight a pill because of Donatism? It happens today all the time. Basically, all well-informed people wanted to reform the church. So all these people were a little sympathetic to Luther. But the papal supremacists, they were in the main slow to get Luther's point. But once they did, they wanted him dead. One problem with arguing the perfection of church authority or infallibility loudly and intensely is that it makes the listeners doubt, just naturally. Remember when we had 2 popes? Remember when we had 3? Good times. And what are those Moravians doing over there again? Luther himself seemed to have moved towards believing the church fallible at this time. He was summoned to Rome to face charges of heresy. Good thing he didn't go. That changed the incentives for Luther. Now he was in a life and death situation. How would you react if your life was threatened this way? And here he is, a super talented guy fighting for his life now, and isn't there a little inevitability there? Back to the hard problem of history, a smart, insightful student of Augustine is going to raise these issues. How could he not? The issue of justification versus authority is right there. Didn't Roberto Calasso say that the history of the West is an extended conversation within Augustine's mind?
Who said that?
Roberto Calasso, probably the greatest intellect outside the sciences of the 20th century. If you want to understand sacrifice, legitimacy, Marx, Stirner, Nietzsche, ancient Greek thought, or ancient Hindu thought, he's the best.
Never heard of him.
He was Italian and wrote in Italian, so you can only read him in translation. 200 years from now, the sensitivity most intellectuals have to, how should I put it, their weakness for Marxism will fade, and he'll be recognized as one of the greatest writers and minds of the 20th century.
That's a prediction.
Yeah, anyway. Many Italian French Catholics came to the same thoughts as Luther regarding justification and love. They wrote them down, so we know about them today. They didn't have Luther's flair, but if they stayed below the radar, stayed in the purely intellectual world of treatises written in Latin, they would be ignored by the Inquisition. Evidence for this is that Luther's opponents in debates would end up pretty much on his side, even on the red-hot issues of authority, with the conclusion that the idea that the church could influence God directly was silly, and published things saying so. So long as they also said Luther was wrong to oppose the Pope, they could actually agree with him about everything else, as long as you made people read between the lines, even more openly than the Straussian reading Valkyrie advocated on the podcast. I don't want to cover all the debates, but they boiled down to papal authority versus God's grace. Is Christ the head of the church, or is the Pope? Was John Hus right? Luther said yes, publicly. You remember that Hus picked up Wycliffe's ideas of a local church. Rome had no grace to give. Now Luther was picking up these ideas and denying papal authority. A papal bull excommunicated Luther. Luther burned that bull at the gates of Wittenberg in front of everyone, looking for all the world like an Old Testament prophet in action. And he wasn't just a talented showman, but a great writer. He wrote Address to the Christian Nobility of the German Nation. The Pope was Antichrist. He had to be. The emperor and the nobles should take on the mantle of Christian leadership, and he gave them solid intellectual footing to do it. He also attacked the separation of clergy from laity. We're all people, bro, and this separation, celibacy, is symbolic of it, and it should end. We need a brotherhood under natural, secular leadership. We need spiritual togetherness based on love, not a spiritual hierarchy. The hierarchy is a distraction that actually gets in the way of love and brotherhood. And again, when I say love and brotherhood, it sounds very airy-fairy in English in the 21st century, but I'm talking about the highest intellectual and spiritual levels humans are capable of. Today we use phrases like ethical altruism, consequentialism, trust, voluntarism, mutual cooperation, and market economy for these ideas. He wrote another book called The Babylonian Captivity of the Church, aimed at the clergy this time. It reminded everyone of the Avignon period and the three-pope period. It was devastating for Germans and the Scandinavian clergy. Possibly this may have been because the Pope was draining a lot more money from Germany and Scandinavia. The church in France, Spain, and Italy had already been reformed quite a bit, in Spain a lot. That's why they could be such a powerful rock for the papacy. But the Pope was still getting anneals from Germany, a lot more money. Germany and Scandinavia were a sweet source of cash for the papacy. The popes do not face the kind of limits on their revenue that existed in France, Spain, and Italy. Now, to understand this, it helps me to bring it down to a smaller scale. A little country, Denmark, on both sides of the Sound at that time, had church-owned lands about 25%, which were exempt from the main taxes. A full third of the land within Copenhagen and Malmö were church lands, the most valuable lands, and exempt. That meant the other 3/4, 2/3 had to pay for all the state, which commanded tax levels at about the same rate we have now upon dramatically poorer people in the 16th century. And this wasn't a nice little welfare state they were paying for. It was for a formidable war machine and luxuries for nobles. Taking over those church lands and getting capital for it, and then taxes, which could lower the burden on everybody else, and then 10% off the top going to Rome, which could now stay home. You could make your life better. For poor people, boosting your income at least 10% is big. You could promote love and not really change your actual day-to-day religious practice much. This is a win-win-win. You just need someone to come along and convince you to do it. The fact of the Purgatory con game, the scammy indulgence sellers, and oh yeah, the Pope is Antichrist. Germany is a much bigger palette. It's much harder to understand. See, this worked in some places and not others. It also half worked everywhere. So in what we now think of as Catholic Germany, the Southwest, Bavaria, and Austria, first that had to be purged and repressed. Thousands were killed, tens of thousands made refugee. So much for nobles in the church. The break with Rome would be good for the ones who were willing to do it. Nobles get money, clergy can get married. It wasn't an easy change. Give up something you believed in all your life. Not everyone could do it. And then, because we have different beliefs, let's kill each other and in the process harden our beliefs some more. Jolly fun. Let's do it again and again. But what about ordinary people? Luther's third book was for them. The Freedom of a Christian, where he dealt with the problem of why we should be good. You see, if we are too insignificant to influence God, then our behavior doesn't matter at all. God sacrificed for us, died in anguish for us. We are too terrible, too pathetically weak to keep the commandments, and he has saved us anyway. Our own actions are too insignificant. On a scale of 1 to God, we aren't even 1, really. We cannot influence God at all, so why bother to be good, or at least not be bad? Luther took a unique take and refused to see it as a problem. He embraced the paradox in joyful language. A Christian is a perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none. A perfectly free Lord of all, subject to none. A Christian will just naturally be good, in gratitude to God for saving him. No problem. Love does not play by rules, it just works. Love does not play by rules, it just works. This is a deep psychological truth about love. It resonated. But, and there is a big but, I cannot lie, he released the word freedom into one of the most repressed environments in Europe. He told people they were free. He didn't mean it the way they heard it. Oops. And just as a by the way, he also translated the Bible into High German and left a permanent mark on the German language. He wrote powerful hymns revealing great artistic power, while also writing super powerful, influential polemics. It's really interesting because at some point I want to get into polemics and ask the question of whether polemics are inherently evil. No answers here, but it looks like a possibility.
I don't know about that. Seems like all sides need to be argued. If people who worry about good stop arguing for it, only the people who want evil will be polemical and persuasive.
Yeah, that's a tough one. It reminds me of arms control policy. I'm still questioning. We're not up to Milton yet, either. And there were equally thorny, paradoxical issues going on in the Reformation. Lots of people, just like Luther, sprang up, and lots of brilliant people came to Luther and gave order to his writings. You started to see people wrecking religious images. And Luther started very early on to urge moderation and caution. Move slowly and carefully. Gratitude should bring acceptance, right? But nature's radicals were loose, as Stirner would predict, as Burke would predict. It was time for an earth-shattering kaboom. Radical views, like no one should ever join the army, spread in places like Switzerland and small cities all over Germany where radical preachers gained followings too big, too fast for local authorities to respond. People were reading the New Testament and picking up on the radical parts of Christ's message that say, go out and spread the word, and out they went. I'm going to skip most of the religious upheaval because they require too much background to understand why people should kill each other over things like infant versus adult baptism. But one weird thing was a statue of the Virgin being denounced as a witch and then ducked in a river, which then floated. It was a wooden statue. So they pronounced it guilty and then burned it. Probably the source for that scene in Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Yes, if she weighs the same as a duck, she's made of wood, and therefore a witch.
At least they didn't burn a real woman that time.
I know. England averaged around 5 witch burnings a year, but I don't know the level of it in German-speaking areas. That statue was actually burned in Riga, kind of on the fringe of European civilization at the time. Some of the iconoclasts attacked Orthodox churches too and burned their icons. Not a tolerant time when radicals decide it's time for a change. Luther was revolted by the destruction of art and by the spontaneous popular movements which rose up in his name, but were not led by natural rulers. He was a Romans 13:1, which implies earthly authority comes from God type of guy, who paradoxically embraced Acts 5:29, which says, we must obey God rather than man. A great mind can reconcile different ideas like yin and yang, but out in the wild, the radicals mostly bent on destruction got busy destroying. The monsters wearing human skins were loose. In 1521, Luther had the moment he's most famous for, the diet of worms. Yuck. It would end in a death sentence, which would never be carried out thanks to a dramatic staged kidnapping and powerful protectors. Where's Luther? I don't know. I heard he got kidnapped. Briefly, there he was in front of the Holy Roman Emperor, many princes, landgraves, margraves, bishops, archbishops, prince-bishops, crown princes. Well, you get the picture. He said his piece. They decided he was guilty of heresy and rejection of papal authority at least. The great question was posed to him. Will you recant? In canon law, which is church law, if you recant, you live. He asked for a day to think about it. The emperor granted it. Quite a mark of respect. The next day he stood up and gave a dignified and humble reply for a couple of hours, impressing many in the audience, an opportunity not wasted. Usually we translate and summarize the response into 2 lines, 2 of the most powerful sentences uttered in world history. In response to, "Will you recant?" he said, "Here I stand. I can do no more."
Wow, that was brave. Saying no to the emperor with your life on the line.
Yeah, it was. Next week, we'll finish up our coverage of the Reformation in Germany after conversations with Camie.
Okay, we'll figure it out.
All right, Camie, you just had a chance to hear Joltin Joe, a surprise guest, and...
Yes, I did. Rare topic. I had always known that there were people who had been paid to pray.
Paid to pray.
Paid to pray, especially I think after deaths, to keep them from having a horrible afterlife and that kind of thing. But I didn't know about these shysters who were selling indulgences. Yeah, a penny for a week out of purgatory. It's like buying a vacation.
Yeah, and it's that sort of psychological truth that if you fall for one of these scams, when you finally realize it's a scam, then you're pissed.
Yes, you are. These people were believers if they're paying for a penny for a week off of purgatory. They probably had to save for that penny.
They got convinced it was a scam.
So I'm glad to hear that. So many people are scammed every day and they don't believe it, even when it's right in front of them.
I love how they used to give receipts.
Yeah.
It's like you'd be up there before St. Peter. See, I got a receipt. I don't have to stay in purgatory.
But the pearly gates. Can I wait a week? I paid this penny. Or can I come in and after a month or two take a week off? You know, I'm like I said, picturing it as vacation from purgatory. You mentioned Luther's being a big teacher of love, and that is something I remember from my schooling. What you didn't call it, which I'm kind of curious about, is the agape love. The highest form of Christian love is usually in this day taught as agape love.
Yeah, that's interesting. You know, there are these gradations of love that people feel it's necessary to make, and I run into that in religious history, in books on philosophy and theology, and I didn't put it in the podcast, and it's not going to be in the podcast because I'm not convinced.
And a different word, agape's from the ancient Greek.
And if we add a taxonomy that's not really valid, I think we run the chance of misleading people. And there isn't any that I completely agree with. I see people who are maybe trying to teach worry about people mixing up romantic love with other kinds of love, but I don't think that's going to be a problem for the podcast audience. It's complex enough.
You made a comment about Pope as the Antichrist, and now a Pope is very revered by many. So how did the Church get past this? Was it the kings later that took on the Catholic religion, or what?
Well, feelings about the Pope calmed down. Feelings about the papacy calmed down once it stopped being a hot issue. And people in the first generation who had to make that, big psychological leap to reject the church, to strike out on their own. Once that was over, there's no reason to have all these harsh feelings towards the Pope. And even the really convinced ones got that idea that Pope was Antichrist, that the institution was Antichrist. But not necessarily everybody believed it. But it was a good argument. It was a convenient argument. And especially when you're going to take that first step, that first break from Rome.
That little baby step.
That little baby step. Well, that little baby step means you get to put a lot of money in your pocket. It's a gargantuan windfall for that first generation of Lutheran kings and dukes and princes.
Thank you for sharing all of that.
I'd like to thank Joltin Joe for coming on the program. And I'd like to give a thank you for all of you out there who are recommending the podcast to your friends. Whatever you're doing, it's working, and I'm very gratified.